Hello, everyone. So welcome back. This is Microeconomics. Today we are going to move into this new chapter to talk about international trade by using our simple supply-demand models. So the topics today actually has two partitions of the topics. So we would like to investigate on the trade scenarios, how international trade might benefit the domestic markets for imports, and also we want to know how it affects the markets benefits when the domestic market is doing exports. And later we would like to discover some of the effects from the policy side. So we would like to investigate on the effect of tariff, or maybe if we are going to cover, we are going to talk a little bit about the quota system. So again, this chapter, it's basically an extension from our previous supply-demand chapter. We would like to use the model that we built already and try to use it and investigate the changes. However, in chapter 2, we kind of opened up the topics of trade in general. So we were using a PPF model to demonstrate a two countries scenarios. We can actually find that there are multiple or maybe infinite many opportunities that the two countries can make trade with each other by taking their comparative advantage to produce the good that they can produce at the lowest opportunity cost, and later to specialize on those productions and make trade with other countries. So, of course, this is a very interesting way to investigate the benefit of trades from the PPF model. But today, what we're going to do is to discover the actual values of gains. So in the previous chapter, we kind of using the PPF model to talk about like how many more of each goods we can get on both sides of the trade involved parties. But today, we want to actually quantify those benefits. So we would like to start with reviewing this consumption or consumer and producer surplus analysis in order to use this concept here to quantify the benefits of trades. So as discussed in the previous chapter, we talk about how we are going to evaluate the consumer surplus in the market when the market is at equilibrium, and also the producer surplus in the markets when the market is at equilibrium. So those are the two areas that we can calculate easily on the graph. So whenever we are thinking about the welfare of a market, how much total benefits gain from the markets, we can always sum the consumer surplus and producer surplus in the graph and trying to get the total surplus of the markets. Again, the total surplus represent the total well-being being captured by the people involved in the markets, including both the consumer side and the producer side. So the total surplus will tell us about the sum of the benefits from the consumer and producer. So today we would like to use this concept again to evaluate the total gains of the markets with the opportunity to trade. So we start with some example here. So we would like to imagine maybe there is a country called South Africa, and we are basically assuming that South Africa is a closed economy. They don't trade with anybody in the world, and they have this domestic markets for bubblegum. And since the market is closed to only just for domestic producers and consumer to interact with each other, the market equilibrium will be driven to this market equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, the PD and PQD, or PD and QD in the graph. So this is a case where we say that South Africa, it's actually a closed economy on autarky. It's the word that we use to explain the closed economy situations. So in this case, of course, calculating the consumer surplus and producer surplus is not difficult because we have done this so many times in the previous chapters. So we would like to know, what if South Africa actually open up the economy and start making trades with the other part of the world? So again, the domestic surplus can be calculated by the two triangles here, the consumer surplus and producer surplus triangles in the domestic markets with the closed economy case or autarky case. Now let's assume that South Africa governments finally get to the point and start opening up the economy and start allowing trades with other part of the world. And we actually seen this open economy start realizing, hey, there is a different prices of bubblegums in the international markets. So let's say that we have the world price of bubblegum, which is put it here, demonstrated by this price, PW, on the graph. And we would like to know how the domestic markets of South Africa, bubblegum markets, will react to this new world price that they've seen. So again, you can imagine it's almost like you're living in the world that you don't know how bubblegum was charged in the world before the open of the economy. All of a sudden, you're facing this new price, right? So you basically have this domestic equilibrium price that tells you bubblegum it's $3 per pack. But once the economy is open for trades, immediately you see this new bubblegum price, which drops to $2. So we want to know how the domestic consumers and producers will react to this new informations and opportunity to trade with different people in different parts of the world. The easy way to do this is to start thinking about how the consumers or the producers will individually react to this new world price. So when import is allowed, the importer will buy the bubblegum from abroad and we sell them domestically for profits. So as you can see here, the world price of bubblegum is much lower. So you can imagine maybe buying a pack of bubblegum in Germany, it's only costing $2. But the people living in South Africa, they used to buy the bubblegum at $3 per pack. And there is a margin for someone to bring in this very cheap and low price bubblegum from Germany to South Africa to sell for profits. So maybe you will buy a $2 pack of bubblegum from Germany and sell the bubblegum in South Africa for maybe $2.50 so that you can make 50 cents of profits, which make perfect sense. So it provides incentive. It provides incentive for importer to start importing the products to South Africa. And in this case, the bubblegum will be imported until when it will start. So if you're an importer, you would like to keep importing these products to South Africa to make money. But of course, at some point, you would like to stop. You would like to stop selling this bubblegum from different part of the world in South Africa until the last buyer willing to pay this price to buy from you, that you can still at least break even. So in this case, if you look very carefully on the demand curve, the domestic demand curve in the graph, you can actually find that point where PW, the dotted lines, it's meeting or intercepting the domestic demand curve, the downward sloping demand curve in the graph. And that's the point where the last units of bubblegum will be imported to the domestic market of South Africa. So to summarize this, we want to know how this country, South Africa, the bubblegum markets will react to this open economy. So the easy way to think about this is to start thinking about how the consumer surplus will be affected. Again, just like how we said it before, in a closed economy format, we know that the consumer surplus and producer surplus will be represented by the blue and red triangles here. Now, with the open economy, we would like to think about how this new price will affect the people buying and selling bubblegum in South Africa. Well, first of all, the domestic consumer surplus will definitely be changing. Well, except for this area A right here, that previously people buying the bubblegum, we're also seeing a lot more people buying bubblegum. So now the new consumer surplus will look like this. Again, well, how do we know we have the area A plus B plus C? Because we know the new price in South Africa for bubblegum is going to drop until this wool price, which is PW. And when we look at the demand curve, we know that the consumers in South Africa, they will keep buying the bubblegum until the last person who is willing to pay this PW will buy the last piece. And after that, no one will buy the bubblegum in South Africa because no one values bubblegum as high as this wool price. And again, well, the importer will also give up for selling this product. Well, at this point, we know the size of the consumer surplus in this market, but how is it going to affect the producer surplus? Well, because we are not having the area B to get into the producer surplus anymore, and we have to figure out, well, how many units the domestic firm will produce this bubblegum in South Africa. So if you think a little bit more carefully on this graph, you probably find the answers. Well, as you know, the domestic supply curve represents the domestic producers in South Africa. And now we know that the market price in South Africa for bubblegum is going to drop to PW, which is a much lower price than the previous domestic equilibrium price. Well, in this case, that means, well, the domestic firm will only be able to charge the price of PW. So if you look at the price PW and you are looking to the right-hand side, you are going to find where the supply curve will meet this PW price, which will stop at the quantity QS, which indicated on the quantity of bubblegums in this graph. So firms in South Africa will keep producing until they meet no profits. So that means, well, they will keep producing until QS, and that's the minimum price they have to charge in order to make up their costs, and they will stop producing. So in this case, the domestic producer surplus will be only area D. Now the question is, when we're seeing this graph, we want to compare to the previous equilibrium case. We want to know, well, whether we are doing better or not. Well, when we are doing without the trades, as you can see from the graph, the consumer surplus and the producer surplus will only contain the total of A, which is the consumer surplus, and plus B plus D, which is the total producer surplus. However, when we have an open economy, the consumer surplus will be A plus B plus C, and the producer surplus will only have area D. But the total surplus will still be greater than the domestic market selling without any trades. So in general, the conclusion from this analysis here let us know not only when the country actually trading with other country, we will be able to gain from trading, we can now actually quantify the size of the benefits by using this surplus analysis. And the total gains of this trade scenario will be the area C that we are going to get more from the tradings. So this is basically the total increase in surplus in the economy as a whole. So this is going to be a very good foundation for us to understand how trade will actually provide a better solutions in the markets with the higher level of surplus. Again, when the country is not given the choice to trade, we are limiting ourselves of how much surplus we can gain from the markets. But with the opportunity to trade with other countries, we are now having this additional gain from trades. So let's say we are also interested in not just importing, we are also interested in how export will affect the economy too. So in this case, we would like to think about the example in Japan. So let's say Japan is an open economy, and we assume that Japan can produce a limited quantity of digital watch, and let's say at any given price. Assuming very simply, Japan's firms will just respond to the price of the watch. They can actually produce as many as they want as long as the price is right. And also, by looking at the graph here, we are showing you guys the domestic supply and demands in Japan markets. So let's say there is a equilibrium for domestic markets in Japan, which is PD and QD. And we are putting the wool price into our graph to indicate, well, what happened to the digital watch selling in the world. So the digital watch selling in the world, it's given a much higher average price here than the Japanese domestic price for digital watch. So that means you can imagine if Japan is not a country that open for trades, they will have this domestic price for digital watch, which is maybe you can call it like $100. However, in different part of the world, let's say in Australia, people buying this same digital watch for a price of $120, maybe because they don't produce this at a low cost because they have a higher labor cost, or maybe the technology used is different from the ones in Japan, or maybe for other reasons. So now, let's say the Japan firms and consumers seeing this new price for digital watch from the world. And we would like to know how the consumers and producers respond to these prices. The easy way to think about this is when the higher wool price make it profitable for the exporter to buy the digital watch domestically, and they will sell those watches overseas for profit. So you can imagine maybe if you are living in, let's say, even in Japan or maybe in Australia, you find that, hey, you know what, buying a digital watch from Japan, it's only costing $100, but then people are usually paying $120 to buy the digital watch in the world, let's say from Australia. And you might actually think about, you should buy some of these watches from Japan and ship them into Australia and sell it for profits. Well, the purchase of domestic digital watch drive to the domestic price up until it's equals to the world price. So again, if you can look at the graph again once more time, you can see how the local firms in Japan will react to this high price in the world. So firms, they are looking at a higher price to sell their products, which means they can sell this digital watch for a higher profits. And they would like to sell those products to the world more. So that's why the quantity supply for digital watch increased dramatically. So the firms start producing more. However, the firms would like to earn profits from the world. That means they would like to sell this digital watch not at a price where the domestic people would usually buy. If they know someone in Australia, they would like to buy the same watch they produce in Japan for a much higher price, they would like to charge those prices, $120. And as long as the prices keep going up, the domestic people in Japan, the domestic consumer in Japan, will also facing the same price as world markets faced. And at the end, well, prices is going to rise in Japan up to PW. Now, again, we would like to evaluate how is this open economy, the world price of digital watch will affect the welfare in Japan. Very similarly, we would like to put up the world price in a graph, and we would like to think about how the consumer surplus will play out. So in this case, the consumer surplus will only have the area of A, this little triangle up on the top. The reason is because the world price has driven the domestic price to a much higher range. Instead of $100 that people usually buy the watch, now the price actually went up to $120 in Japan. And there will be less people willing to buy domestically. As you can see, the quantity demands domestic in Japan dropped from QD to Q small letter t. However, the producer surplus in this case will be the sum of this area B, C, and D. As you can see, well, it's going to be much larger. And how do we know? Well, because the domestic firm is going to respond to the demand in the world. Since the world market is willing to pay $120 to produce this watch, to buy these watches from the Japanese firm, the Japanese firms will react and trying to produce more. And as you can see, the quantity supplied in this case will increase dramatically. So by the end, we can see that without any trades in Japan, the consumer surplus will only be area A and B in the graph, and producer surplus will be area D. And the combine of the three will be the total surplus without any trades. With the trade scenarios, Japan's market will have the consumer surplus equals to area A, and the producer surplus will equals to area B plus C plus D. So at the end, of course, the conclusions tell us, in the case of exports, Japan's digital watch markets can actually gain a total welfare of area C. So this is basically confirming that, well, not only the imports case can benefit the economy by increasing the welfare share in the markets, but the export case also provide the same values of gains to the markets. However, one thing that you have to always note, so not imports and exports are always going to help the economy, because sometimes when we gaining something, we have to actually lose something. So there's always a trade-off to make improvements in our economy. So especially when we have an import case, and you can see it from the previous example, most of the time when we increase imports from other countries, it will hurt the domestic producers or the domestic firms and businesses, because we are not allowing them to charge a price that can let them produce enough to hire people in the economy. However, well, it does help the domestic consumer, because in those cases, the domestic consumer will be able to buy those products at a much lower price. In the export case, well, it's a reverse. Most of the time, the consumer will be hurting domestically because they have to pay a much higher price for the same products, but it will help domestic producers to gain the productions and profits by selling the product to the world. However, in each case, you have to keep in mind the total gains of the economy or the total gains of the market is much larger than the previous, the non-trading case. So that means, well, if we only look at the total welfare of the markets, either import or export still providing a gain, overall gains to the markets. So as a policymaker, of course, sometimes we actually consider whether we should promote import or exports. Well, there are some arguments in the world, such as, well, the effect of international trade, it's not on the producers, right, or consumers in a particular industry. It also has effects to the domestic workers. So in the case of importing, as you have seen in the previous example, the total productions in the country might actually go down because of the lower price charged in the markets. And when the firms and businesses domestically, they reduce the total productions for the products, obviously they are going to reduce the total number of workers in the productions. And the demand for labor will go down, and as well as the wages will also fall. However, when the demands for labor increase, of course wages is going to rise. As an important country, import country, less goods and services will be produced domestically. So the demand for labor will go down and wages will fall. And this is basically the arguments from our presidents that always talks about how we should limit the trade and restrict trades in order to boost the domestic economy to increase jobs opportunity in the country. However, on the exporting case, let's say, well, in Japan or China or maybe in Germany, those exporting countries actually allow the firms, the domestic firm, to produce more goods and services, and in order to boost the economy by increasing the labor hired and also the wages. But either case, I would say the overall gains can still be expressed in the previous surplus analysis, which is by the graph of the supply-demand models. Now, of course, we would like to also investigate on how the policy will affect the benefits of trades. Let's suppose we do not want to have a completely 100% open economy. Let's suppose the government is planning on helping the domestic firms in the case of open economy. So we know in an importing case, firms and businesses domestically are going to get hurt. So let's say if the government has the incentive to give a little hand to the domestic firm and businesses. Well, there are many policies that can be used for this purpose. And specifically, we would like to talk about the effect of the tariff policy. So tariff, it's basically a form of excise tax, or sometimes people call this the import tax for goods and services. So this is the forms of tax that usually used to prevent any failures of the domestic businesses or industries in order to provide them the opportunity to gain their businesses in the domestic markets. And we are going to this new country here, let's say South Korea. And we would like to take a look at the car or car productions or car markets. So let's suppose we have the domestic market for automobiles in South Korea presented in the graph like here. We know the domestic equilibrium price for the car, and we know this South Korea country has an open economy, and the world price for car in this situation, it's much lower than the domestic equilibrium price in South Korea. And as you can see, if Korea is a 100% open economy, free trade economy, it's very unfortunate to see this happens where the domestic firm will face this competition from the world, and they have to lower the price of the car to match with the world price in order to compete with the international competitors. However, because the world price is much, much lower than the domestic equilibrium price, it's almost driving all the domestic firms to extinct in the markets. Well, in order to avoid that, suppose the South Korean government decided to help the domestic firm from this open economy competitions, and they put a tariff on each car that they import. Let's say, well, $10,000 per car that they import from other countries. Well, this tariff will actually rise the firm's price in this domestic market. Or simply, we basically say that, well, the tariff actually add this additional cost to the international car competitors for selling their car in South Korea. So whenever a car is being imported from some other country to South Korea, well, the domestic firm do not have to pay this tariff because they have the car produced domestically. However, is their competitor, the world competitor, to pay this cost in order to sell their products in South Korea. So with this tariff implemented to these markets, we can see now the new competitive price in the domestic markets of South Korea will rise to this new price, PT, and refer to the price with tariff. So when the price actually rises in South Korea, we want to know how it's going to affect the welfare and how it compares to the trade scenario where the open economy is a 100% free trade case. So in order to evaluate, of course, we have to use the surplus analysis here. So we want to actually use this area of the graph to represent the surplus gain from the consumer side and the producer sides. So again, the first part we want to plot out here is basically the total consumer surplus in the case of free trades. So area A, B, C, D, and E will be the total gains of consumer surplus in South Korea if there is no tariff, no policy involved. It's basically just one free open trade market. And the producer surplus, because, well, the producers in South Korea cannot survive, and they will only left with this one little tiny area, area F, as the benefits to gain. Now we would like to evaluate, what if we have a tariff that drive the price, the domestic price, to PT. So if we look at the total gains of surplus, the tariff, before the tariff, the consumer surplus is the size of A, B, C, D, and E, and the producer surplus is area F. Now, when the price is driving up to PT in the graph with the tariff, well, first of all, now the domestic consumers will have to pay PT for every car they buy in the markets, because they can no longer buy the car at the world price, because every single car imported to South Korea will have this additional cost of the tax. So that's why, well, the domestic firm will also be able to charge at a higher price, which is PT in the markets. And when that's the case, this is when the domestic producer will increase the quantity of supply in the market and selling up to QTS quantity. So that's why the total gain for the producers will be area A plus area F in this case. The consumer surplus will be area E in the graph. The reason is because, well, now the price of the car will rise to PT, and the consumers domestically in South Korea, they will keep buying the car until it hits the price on the demand curve where PT is meeting the demand curve domestically. Now the question left to us to answer is, what about area B, C, and D? So we want to think about those area and how those welfare is being treated in this tariff case. Well, first of all, you want to think about this area C, the rectangle. So if you think a little bit more clearly, area C basically have the heights of the rectangle, which is between PT and PW. And that basically is the total amounts of tax per 1 unit of car being imported. So if the import tax is $10,000 per car, well, the height of this rectangle will be $10,000. And you look at the length of the rectangle C from QST to QDT. So in this case, well, the local producer in South Korea will produce up to QST, which is the domestic quantity supply of car. However, the domestic buyers will buy up to QDT, which is the domestic quantity demands for car with the tariff case. And the gap between the two, we have to think about, well, if the domestic producer only produces 100 cars, but the consumer can buy up to 150 cars, then where is the consumer buying those 50 extra cars when the domestic firm are not producing it? And of course, the answer is pretty clear to see. The distance between QST and QDT, it's basically the total quantity of car is being imported. So in this case, we have the length of the rectangle represent the quantity of car imported. The height of the rectangle represent the price, the tax it's being collected by the government for each car being imported. So the area C right here basically represents the total amounts of tax revenues or tariff collected by the government for imported cars. Now we have answered the questions for box C. We still have area B and D left. And in this case, unfortunately, no one is going to collect the area B and D in the graph. So that means, in this case, those two triangles in the graph will go into what we call a deadweight loss. So with that said, we can now evaluate. So the consumer surplus before the tariff will have area A, B, C, D, and E. But after the tariff, we only have area E left. The producer surplus will only have area F before the tariff. However, now the producer surplus will gain because, well, it has the area A plus F, which is the gain of area A compared to the free trade scenario. The government is going to collect the tax revenues or tariff from the markets for whatever car that's being imported, and that total amount of tariff will be area C. So again, this is being captured locally by the government. Now the question is, well, we are going to suffer a loss. So the deadweight loss in this case will be the loss of area B and D, because those are the transactions cannot be completely captured in the economy and also cannot be captured in the markets, so that those potential gains of benefit cannot be captured by anyone. So as a result, we're actually losing area B and D with tariff policy. So the total gains of trade is being limited in this case with the tariff. So you can imagine that tariff is basically one out of many different policy tools that we can use to limit trades or to help the domestic firms to survive from the world competitions. Well, another very famous policy that our government usually use is called the import quota. So quota policy, it's basically another forms of limitations for trade. So instead of setting a tax or tariff to increase the price for the product domestically, the government can also set restrictions on the total quantity being imported from other countries. So there are some very famous quota policy in the past and also in the current periods. So one of the most famous one maybe is the quota on cotton products from China. So in the US, we actually give a quota quantity limit for the total quantity of cotton productions coming in from China to the United States. So those quota policy work exactly the same way as we discussed in the tariff policy. So the only difference is the governments can actually control the gap between the QST and QDT in the graph, so that they can set the quantity limit. So instead of having 50 car imports, they can actually set the maximum quantity of imports to 30. Well, the more restricted quantity to set in the markets, it will drive the domestic price higher because people would like to buy those products from the domestic firm to actually get to get to the products when the imported product is being limited. Of course, the only way the consumer will get the product is from buying the local firms. And when the local firms need to produce more, obviously they have to charge a higher price in the market. But either the tariff policy or the quota policy will actually generate what we call the deadweight loss in the market. So we have to always keep in mind that it's not as easy as we thought of those policy. So whenever a policy get into a free trade market, it always affects the markets in some way. And in this case, we can definitely see it from the deadweight loss that we can capture in the graph. Well, there are a lot of arguments about trades or international trade in general, especially in the recent decades. We have always talked about the trade protections. So if tariff and import quotas are going to reduce the total surplus, then why we still want to impose those trade policies? Well, there are three main arguments in the trade protections discussions. So we always talk about in the US too. So number one, national security. Right? So there are some products that we think we should be the one producing it and not having other people to produce. For example, like weapons, right? Or maybe telecommunications technologies. So those are the things that we promote to produce domestically instead of buying from some other country that we might actually get into a national security problems. Number two, job creations. That's what our current president suggests to boost the job positions in the domestic country, to increase the total job positions in the country. One way to do it is to limit the buy from the outside world and trying to produce it domestically so we can actually create those job positions in our countries. Well, another argument, it's very famous or very popular in the developing world. We call this infant industry. So the infant industry basically refer to those industry that just started in the domestic countries. So in the developing country, you can imagine that there are many industry. Maybe they just started. Maybe someone just invests a $1 million to produce a computer chips. But when those country devoting those resources on a new industry, it's hardly be the case where those small infant industry can compete with the world's industry, like the one that already have the technology to do it. So in order to promote the growth of those technological improvements, sometimes the country will put on a tariff or maybe even a restrictions of trade on those particular products or in those particular markets in order to help the infant industry to grow bigger until they actually competitive enough to fight with other firms in the world. However, trade protections in the United States are still very limited because, well, number one, most of the economists in the United States believe that, well, free trade is always a better solution to a trade restrictions. And also, the United States is the world leader in the past decades, and we have been promoting a lot of trades in different parts of the world in order to engage and promote growth of this healthy gains of gain from trade interactions. So international trade agreement is also another promotions to this topics. So some of the important world trade agreements that we know already. One is called International Trade Agreements, which is a treaty in which country promise to engage in less trade protections, right? We reduce the total amounts of tariff, reduce the total amounts of quota policy against the exports of another country in returns for promise by other country to do the same for its own exports. Some of these examples include the North America Free Trade Agreements between US, Canada, and Mexico, or the European Union, which is a combined agreement with the 28 nations in Euros. Well, there are many other organizations also help facilitate trades. One of the most famous one is called the World Trade Organizations, WTO. This is basically an organization composed of 160 members of countries. The main objective or goals to achieve from the WTO, it's number one, to provide the framework for major international trade agreements. And also number two, to resolve any disputes between its member, to basically reduce arguments between countries, or to reduce sometimes to promote trades by reducing the tensions of the two countries being involved in arguments. However, even though we have so many reasons to promote trades, or maybe to put on a trade protections, either way, I think it's very important for us to know the problem of international trade is not just about the surplus analysis, the debt rate loss, or maybe for the gain of surplus in the markets. There are many other things that also have been brought up in the recent decades, such as how globalizations affects the inequality in the world, and also outsourcing, like child labors in the developing countries. So those are the things that we also needs to be concerned about international trade topics. So in general, we want to know if the international trade actually benefits the trading countries. And we want to know how we can eliminate some of these issues from this international trade promotions. Most of the economists will still tell you today that the gain from trading is going to be much larger or exist to the cost for international trade, or maybe the problem that we create from international trade. However, we have to be very careful when we're evaluating a trade policy, how the trade policy will affect maybe income inequality in the countries, how it affects the unemployment in the country, and how it affects the country to develop high-skilled industries to get out of the slums. So those are the topics, and those are the things that we have to always evaluate and constantly look over. However, hopefully this chapter actually provides you with a very clear way to evaluate at least the fundamental benefits of trades, and how the policy will affect the benefits from trade in the world. All these other topics, I hope that you can get back to the readings of the textbooks and find out more from the examples there. So again, so this is a very interesting chapter, and after this, we are going to move on to the study of firms' operations. So this will be probably the last videos to cover using the simple supply-demand models. So starting the next one, we are going to get a little bit more complicated and more in-depth to the study of firms' operations, so that we can learn more about how decision is being made by the firms in a single market. So I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.